Yeah, there we go.
Oh, goodness. I wasn't expecting to say anything.
Sorry.
No problem. So, we're very excited about once a month we will be visiting different organizations that the cathedral supports, either through our various guilds or just organizations that we've been supporting. So, for example, we went to Emmaus House just before the summer, and it was really fantastic. We got to learn more about their programs and kind of understand what their needs are so that we can be the most supportive that we can as a cathedral. Our next one coming up is going to be for the in-town community ministries. You've probably seen the big bins that you can collect food for, but we just want to make sure that we're supporting all of our organizations and all of the folks that we really want to help out in the best way that we possibly can, whether that's through donations, food collection, toiletry collection, volunteers. A lot of organizations just need manpower. So if you take a look at the Cathedral Times, which I'm in charge of, you'll see fairly regularly, all of our different outreach opportunities. And so if you see something that really calls to you and you're interested in joining that particular ministry, we'd love to have you, and you can connect with me or Julia, and we will happily put you on a list for a field trip or just if you have any questions. So.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Am I a good distance from the... Okay, very good. Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, truly, but I did want folks just to be able to connect a name with a face, because Sarah wears so many different hats here and does so much for us, both, as I said, in terms of outreach and also communications. But because she does so much with communications, she is behind the scenes a lot. And so want to take advantage of opportunities for you all to get to know her and for her to get to know you. And joining us for one of these upcoming outreach field trips would be a great way to do that. So thank you, Sarah, for all that you do and for being here today. And I suspect that, when the time comes, I'm going to have to run off to the service, but I suspect that Sarah might have 5 or 10 minutes maybe after this forum if folks have specific ministries that you want to ask about or questions regarding outreach. Work? Very good. Thank you. All right. Well, I have to confess that I have lured you all here today under false pretenses. I know you're surprised. As George says, I like to be provocative. The published description of this class that went out said that I'd be talking about the cathedral's various outreach ministries, and that's not entirely true. I will be mentioning some of our ministries here at the cathedral, our outreach ministries, especially towards the end of our time together. But what I really want to spend the bulk of the next 40 minutes or so doing is discussing not the mechanics of outreach, that is, where you can volunteer your time or donate your money, and how you can get hooked up with different organizations, though all of that is important, obviously, and we are blessed to have Sarah to help us with so much of that. But rather, so I don't want to talk so much about the mechanics of outreach at the cathedral as I do about a general philosophy, or to put it more accurately, a theology of outreach and of mission. That is, why outreach? Why mission? Why volunteer? Why give money? Why advocate through the cathedral or any place else? Why and how? What's the best way to do it? These are all reasonable questions, I think, in our increasingly dysfunctional and divisive society where so many things just don't seem to work anymore, and where it often seems to make more sense not to reach out to others, but rather to cocoon ourselves at home and to stick with our own kind. I think these are reasonable questions to ask. Why volunteer? Why give money? Why advocate when the needs of the world are so overwhelming? Putting ourselves out there is a risk, and does it really make a dent in the world's problems or even the problems of the city anyway? A Facebook friend of mine posted a photograph on Facebook the other day, and it was a picture of one of those signs outside a restaurant, that you could put the little magnetic letters on. And the sign out front of this restaurant that was pictured in this photo said, "I bet aliens ride past Earth and lock their doors." Maybe so. It's a mess out there, for sure, right? So what can any of us do as individuals that might help in this current environment, this strange, incredibly difficult world in which we live just now? What can we do as individuals? What can we do collectively to help when so many others have tried and failed? And more to some of what I want to talk about today, what can we do, or rather, how can we be? I'm more interested in talking about that. What can we do, and how can we be in relationship to others, to our neighbors, when the methods and the patterns of outreach ministries that have worked for so long no longer seem to work quite as well? Okay? Which brings us to our question du jour: does the church still have a mission? Well, yes. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. I believe it firmly. And the mission is not just dispensing popsicles, though that's really great and important too. Does the church still have a mission? Yes, I suspect all of us here would say, or we wouldn't be here. But you don't have to look very far these days to find people who think that it doesn't. You've all seen the statistics, I'm sure, I suspect, showing that fewer and fewer individuals want to associate themselves with institutional Christianity. It's not just apathy that's causing our dwindling numbers. It's, in some cases, outright hostility. Many people blame the institutional church for large chunks of what ails our society today, and sometimes with good reason. A survey published last year by the Episcopal Church asked, quote, non-religious individuals, "What characteristics do you associate with Christians and the church in general?" And over 50% of these non-religious individuals responded with words such as hypocritical, judgmental, and self-righteous. And polling just slightly lower were terms such as arrogant, unforgiving, and disrespectful. But the news isn't all bad, not by any means. I, for one, happen to think that we are living in one of the most exciting times for the Christian church in at least 100 years, okay? As one of our leaders would say, that's not hyperbole. I really believe it. I think that we are living in one of the most exciting times for the Christian church in 100 or so years, particularly in the field of outreach and mission, of how we love our neighbor. Why do I think this? Well, because of the Rummage Sale. Do you know about the Rummage Sale? The Rummage Sale. The late Phyllis Tickle, Episcopal lay minister, writer, and scholar of American religion and spirituality, used to say that throughout the church's history, every 500 years or so, the church would get rid of all the stuff that had once served a purpose and perhaps even accomplished some good in the church, but that was no longer healthy or useful for the building up of the body of Christ and the church's ministry in the world. Okay, so every 500 years, Phyllis Tickle said, the church has this great rummage sale. So take, for example, the Reformation. What are some of the things that we collectively know were put out in the rummage sale during the Reformation? Anyone? Selling indulgences. Excellent, yes. The Spanish Inquisition, a lot of all that stuff, yes. And the Latin Mass, okay, right? And also the idea, and this is a big one, that priests were the only ministers of the church. Okay, so fast forward several hundred years to the middle part of the 20th century when, through the reforms of Vatican II, even finally the Roman Catholic Church decided to put the Latin Mass out to pasture in favor of services celebrated in the vernacular. And other traditions in the 70s, like our own Episcopal Church, and many, much sooner, we were kind of dragging our heels, but other traditions decided to do away with the notion that all clergy had to be male. Okay, so several big rummage sales through church history. Now, despite the fact that it hasn't been 500 years since these latter reforms I was just mentioning, I think it's safe to say that the Christian church is today having something of a rummage sale, or at least it has the opportunity to have a rummage sale. Different parts of the church right now, and in the couple of decades leading up to right now, have been rethinking their mission in some really interesting ways in response to seismic social changes and environmental concerns, and then, of course, most recently, in response to a global pandemic. Some, not all, but some, I'm happy to say, evangelical churches are finally beginning to reconsider the notion that the primary mission of the church is to try to help people jockey for position in the afterlife. Okay? Go to an evangelical, self-styled evangelical church today, and you may hear more focus on the here and now than you would have even 10 or 20 years ago. Now, what used to be called the mainline churches, some people call us now the old line churches, it includes the Episcopal Church, are realizing, I think, that we can serve a much higher purpose in this world than simply promoting basic morality and the common good. I'm going to say more about that in a minute. I, for one, believe that these periodic rummage sales in church history are very positive things that force the church to consider what it is that the gospel of Jesus has to say to the world in a particular place and time. Nonetheless, just as at an actual rummage sale where people may find themselves reluctant to part with a certain household item or a piece of clothing, there are losses associated with these ecclesiastical rummage sales, with these sorts of ecclesiastical casting offs, as it were. There are losses to be grieved for many in the church that are associated with these church rummage sales. I read recently about the pastor of a large Baptist church in West Philadelphia who lamented, "I miss hell. I miss hell." He said, back in the day when I could leverage sin and hold eternal damnation over people's heads, I could get people to do almost anything. Volunteer, evangelize, give money, anything that needed to be done. I could get it done. I miss hell. Now, in our Episcopal tradition, I think it's typically been more social pressure rather than the threat of eternal damnation that has typically served as a great motivator for a lot of our congregation in terms of outreach and mission. Back in the day when we could claim the church as one of the many great social institutions of our society, along with schools, colleges, and universities, and multitudinous clubs, back in the day when we could actually claim the church as one of our great social institutions, it was easy to get people to Sunday services, right? And it was easy to haul the kids to youth group. Above all, it was easy to get people to volunteer for various ministries, including outreach ministries. Going about and doing good was the cultural norm for the sort of people who frequented the Episcopal Church in the mid to late 20th century. My husband Jack sometimes talks about his father, who in the 70s and even 80s was one of only 2 thoracic surgeons at a hospital in a small town in the Sandhills region of North Carolina that served people from all over that part of the state. And every day, my father-in-law was tasked with sewing people back together after car accidents and stabbings and shootings. He was an incredibly busy man, so much so that right beside his seat at the breakfast table in my husband's childhood home, there was this phone attached to the wall right beside his seat so that he could get status reports on patients while he was finishing his morning oatmeal. So he was an incredibly busy man. And yet, in addition to saving people's lives on an everyday basis, Jack's dad also taught the men's Bible study class at the First United Church of Laurinburg, North Carolina, for 40 freaking years. He also served on the city council, attended Rotary Club faithfully, and helped raise money for virtually every charitable concern you can imagine. Jack reports during those years, we didn't see much of Dad, but that was just what was expected. It was what he had seen his father do and his grandfather do and all the other men he knew virtually. And as I said, he did an enormous amount of good. And I know that there are some of you here, many of you here in this room today who have led similar lives or who have family members, elders who have led similar lives in this old style pattern of really being taught to use every moment you have to do all that you can to promote the common good. And so because of this, because I am not in any way knocking the incredible good that my father-in-law did or the incredible good that has been done in this place, in this cathedral through the years, in the church at large, and by so many of you as individuals. I'm not knocking that. I'm suggesting that we're in a place of change and that we're going to have to do some things differently. So just please bear with me while I make this next statement, to which again is in no way intended to criticize the inestimable contributions of generations of Christians who have reached out in self-sacrificing love and concern for others. Okay, here it comes. Ready? It's time to stop doing so much good. It's time to stop doing so much good in the church in the ways that we have in the past. I'm going to unpack this, don't worry. On a practical level, and many of you, as I see people here and who's here, many of you are well aware of this reality already, that for most families and individuals today, perpetuating these older patterns of outreach and mission that involve a frenetic schedule of volunteerism just really isn't doable anymore for most people. Furthermore, I think one of the things that a lot of us have learned in the past 10 to 20 years or so is that frenetic volunteerism, constant doing, is not always the most efficient way of getting people help when they need it. Sometimes it is, but not always. Doing outreach in this way, where a bunch of us from a large affluent parish come into a situation where people are in need and we think we know exactly what they need, and we have wide, vast experiences and a lot of expertise and things that we would like to teach people. And so our pattern, again, in the mainline churches for most of the second half of the 20th century and some into the 21st has been to gather together, to get a project, and to swoop in with our vast expertise, our life experience, our education, the things that we know about life and are sure that everyone could benefit from knowing. This pattern of volunteerism in the church doesn't always, but can contain elements of imperialism and classism and racism. Furthermore, I think this form of traditional outreach can, again, not always, but can tend to box the heart and soul of Jesus' ministry, neighbor love. It can box this sort of ministry, the ministry of neighbor love, into an activity rather than a way of being in the world. Does that make sense? It makes of the mission of the church an activity rather than a way of being and a pattern of living. Many of you probably know that the earliest Christians referred to the Jesus movement simply as the way, the way. Being a Christian in the early church was seen as a path of life rather than an activity, a path of life rather than an activity to be squeezed in among one's other life commitments. Being Christian in this sense, in the sense of Christianity as a way of life, as a pattern of being, is really all-consuming, right? And in some ways, that can feel, to me, when I think about it, even more daunting than the sort of nonstop volunteerism of my elders. Being a Christian in this way, being a Christian as a way of life and not a series of activities, can seem all-consuming, though not, again, in the sense, I think, of being busy or feeling overwhelmed by too many commitments. But there is a sense, and I think this is really important to acknowledge, there is a sense in which adhering to this understanding of Christianity and Christian mission and Christian outreach as being a way of life rather than an activity, it is something that is really undoable on our own, at least. It's a wonderful writer and pastor from North Carolina, John Pavlovitz. Did anybody read John or subscribe to him on Facebook? Or he's a great guy to read. He's deliberately provocative also, so just bear that in mind. But he's written this fabulous book, and I'll just also tell you in advance, I think it's a great book. Some of you, depending on your political proclivities, will be put off by someone who endorsed the book, but don't let that stop you, please. It's a great book. The book is called If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk. And in this book, If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk, John Pavlovitz talks about a concept that he calls loving beyond our capabilities. And this, for John Pavlovitz, I think, is the heart of what he sees as the new, or rather renewed, I should say, renewed and re-envisioned and reinvigorated mission of the church. To love beyond our capabilities, to act out of a place of knowing that we don't have everything to offer. We don't have all the answers. We don't have all the expertise, even and especially from our point of privilege. We do not have what it takes to go the distance, and yet we are still called to love beyond the distance, to love beyond what we are capable of doing on our own. As Pavlovitz describes this concept, loving beyond our capabilities, he talks about, again, engaging in a ministry that is not just about what we do, but about who we are and how we are with one another, how we relate to our fellow human beings, how we think about them and pray for them and pray with them, and especially how we relate to those whom we may find it most difficult to accept. This man eats with tax collectors and sinners. This was what was so wondrous, right? But also so controversial about Jesus' ministry, that he got close to people no one else wanted to get close to, that he loved bigger and broader and bolder than everyone else. And so, following in the path of Jesus by loving bigger and broader and bolder is a huge part, perhaps, in fact, I think as Pavlovitz would see it, the whole entirety of our mission as the church, our mission as Christians, to love bigger, to love bolder, and to love broader, to love beyond our capabilities. So this is what I too want to suggest may well be the essence of the church's mission during this strange and difficult time. Loving beyond our capabilities, not pretending anymore that we can swoop in and with 30 hours of service a week solve the problems of our world, of our community. So what in this very different day and time, if we're transitioning to a different sort of a paradigm for outreach, for service, for mission, what might this look like? What might it look like practically for us at the Cathedral of St. Philip to love beyond our capabilities, to serve, to reach out as our path of life and not just as an occasional activity that we squeeze in, or in the case of some of us here, a lot of us here today, activities that just can become too much at times so that we have to take a break and even take a break from church. What might this different understanding, this more relational understanding of the church's mission look like? A couple of things. Number one, I think that this loving mission as loving beyond our capabilities is always mindful of our calling to serve the marginalized. I think it always asks the question, how does this ministry here at the Cathedral, how does this program, how does this event prioritize the needs of the least, the last, and the lost in the way that Jesus did? Now, this is not to say, I think, that every single activity we do as a parish has to involve going out into the streets and inviting hungry people to dinner, though Jesus did tell a parable about doing just that. What I think it does ask of us is that we keep what Latin American liberation theologians often call Jesus's preferential option for the poor at the center of our lives as the people of God. And so as we go about, as I said, trying to discern what will be the ministry and mission of this cathedral, we wonder regularly and out loud and in public, even when it's controversial, how does this activity, this worship service, this class, this musical offering, this outreach program reflect the ministry of Jesus, which was at its heart a ministry to the vulnerable and the dispossessed? Okay, so that's thing number one. Point number two, I think more often than not, mission as loving beyond our capabilities will involve risk and the pushing of boundaries. Remember, this man eats with tax collectors and sinners. Daring to believe that we can move beyond simply doing good, and simply doing good out of a sense of obligation and social expectation, daring to believe that we can move both as individuals and as the church beyond doing this to actually forming life-altering relationships with our neighbors, near and far, black and white, rich and poor. This is risky, countercultural business, and not everybody's going to like it, and we have to be okay with that. Next, and this is a related point, this kind of authentic Christian mission for our time, this loving beyond our capabilities, will invariably come at a cost to us. Our time and energy and resources, yes. Just as in any age, we will still have to decide as individuals and as families and as a parish what our priorities really are and to whom and to what we owe our ultimate allegiance. So this is not just a challenge for overscheduled people. They had to prioritize in biblical times too. Remember the ancient Hebrews who again and again had to decide whether they were going to worship the one true God or whether they were going to throw their lot in with pagan idols. We all have these decisions to make about whom and what we are going to serve, and these decisions can be costly. Beyond the obvious constraints of time and energy, I actually think one of the things that hinders our mission most in the postmodern church, and particularly in our branch of the postmodern church, the Episcopal Church, which has carried down through the centuries so much of this sense of kind of noblesse oblige, of doing good, as I said earlier, of doing good works for those less fortunate. One of the biggest things that I think stands to hinder our authentic mission as the church going forward is our natural human longing to feel good about ourselves, our natural human longing to do the right thing. If any of you, like me, are one on the Enneagram, if some of you have studied the Enneagram, I know doing the right thing and being seen as being good and feeling in your heart that you are good is super important. To minister effectively in this broken and troubled world of ours at this particular time, I think, though, we are going to have to let go of this. We are going to need to increase our capacity to go into a setting where we don't receive much affirmation or even a welcome, and be able to stay in that setting even in the midst of our own discomfort. And this is hard. This is super hard. It really is, I know, because we live in a culture that so emphasizes tangible achievement. And so there will be times when of course, when we are able to look at a piece of mission, an outreach project that the Cathedral has engaged in, like when we retired a bunch of medical debt for people a few years ago, and we'll be able to point to statistics and numbers and say, yes, we did that. We really made a dent. That was a great, great thing. But there will be even more times, I think, increasingly moving forward, when we will invariably wonder, gosh, did it matter at all that I went down and volunteered at the homeless shelter today? Did it matter at all that I went to that seminar on recognizing the warning signs of suicide, or that I sat and ate lunch with someone who comes from a completely different socioeconomic background than I do, or that I recognized the dignity of the homeless man in the park by making eye contact with him while I walked by, even though he cursed me out? Does it matter? I think for a lot of us, especially in our culture, being able to move beyond the sense that we are doing what is right, that we are doing something good, is going to be important to our maintaining our stamina in a world that is so challenging. Okay, fourth thing, I think that authentic mission for the postmodern church also tends to come out of our brokenness, and this is related to the prior point, tends to come out of our brokenness rather than out of our competency, our confidence, and our expertise. I mentioned earlier the problems oftentimes historically with a bunch of privileged people like most of us today in this setting, particularly in light of the experience and situation of the whole world. We are pretty privileged. That the problem with a bunch of privileged people coming in and trying to tell a group of not so privileged people what they need to do to get their lives in gears is that it's very can be patronizing and insulting, racist, classist, and all sorts of other things that are not so great. So I think it's a good thing that increasingly our mission as a church is going to, of necessity, need to come out of our places of brokenness. Why? Because if the past 2 years have shown us anything, they have shown us that we are all deeply, profoundly broken. We may not look like it on the outside, but we are broken. We are changed by what has gone on in our world for the past 2.5 years. And looking around, I think pretty much all of us in this room will be dealing with the implications of that for the rest of our lives. And the idea of ministering out of a place of brokenness represents, ironically, and I say ironically because this was the pattern of Jesus' ministry, right? But it represents a real paradigm shift for the church, and especially for congregations like ours that are filled with superstars, with high-achieving individuals. But this is the model that's been used successfully by recovery groups for a long time, right? Since forever. Those who have been broken by life themselves and live to tell the tale become companions to others who are fractured and hurting. And these folks are effective in their outreach, not because they have lived perfect lives, but because their lives have been touched by deep pain, suffering, and regret. In authentic, mission-oriented spiritual communities going forward, I think that we are going to have to come to resemble more and more these recovery ministries, recovery groups, where it's acknowledged that, where there's space to acknowledge failure and to admit flaws, to work through issues and to overcome obstacles. Stephanie Spellers, who is presiding Bishop Curry's Canon for Evangelism, Reconciliation, and Creation, talks in a recent book that she has written about congregations who provide these kinds of spaces as congregations who minister from inside the cracks. Okay? In fact, I'm forgetting, I should have written down the title of her book, but her book, and we have it in the bookstore, I know, is something about ministry from the cracks. Churches, in other words, that minister from inside the cracks, minister not just out of their positions of strength, but out of their weaknesses and vulnerabilities. So a question for all of us maybe to take home today, a question for you, where are those cracks in your life? Where are those places of vulnerability, those places where you haven't got it all together? And how might you, as part of your mission as a follower of Jesus, reach out to help someone else who is struggling out of your own place of brokenness? On a more corporate level, where are the cracks in this cathedral parish? And how might we minister out of these broken places as well as out of our places of excellence and grace? And this brings me to my last point about the markers of what I see as the markers of authentic mission for the church today, of a mission that loves beyond our capabilities. And that is that so much of the effective outreach programs I see today engaged mostly in the work of being present. This is not to say that our words and actions don't matter. This is not to say that raising money to help the neediest in our midst doesn't matter, because it does. It matters enormously. And thanks be to God for all the incredibly generous individuals in this parish who help us make such an impact financially on organizations and individuals that need that impact. But the reality is that the first thing we have to do when we really want to reach out in love to another human being is simply to show up. Okay? We've got to show up. And let's face it, we live in a society in which increasingly people are not showing up. People are heading to the hills, both literally and figuratively. People are leaving the challenging places en masse, particularly since COVID, especially now that so many of us can work from virtually anywhere. People are en masse increasingly leaving the complicated, unpleasant places in search of something easier. People are giving up on the messy old us and are seeking simplicity, the simplicity of I. There's actually another great book out. I once preached a sermon, by the way, when I was first a priest, in which one of the older priests in the parish where I was serving said, well, that was a great book review, and the week before you had a movie review. So it's occupational hazard. I still do it. I recommend lots of books and movies whenever I open my mouth, so sorry. But there's actually a book out by a guy named Robert Putnam. He's the guy, some of you remember, who in the early aughts wrote that fascinating book called Bowling Alone. And it was a book about the increasing solitary nature of American life. Anyway, so in this most recent book that Robert Putnam has written, it's called Upswing, by the way, he looks at our tendency historically here in America to bounce back and forth between the I and the we pendulum. A shift towards we on the pendulum, Putnam points out, represents a focus, as you can imagine, on collectivism and on the common good. And a shift to the I puts more emphasis on the individual and the welfare of one particular person. And right now, Putnam observes in this book, Upswing, we in our society are in a radical I pendulum swift. We're stuck in, as he puts it, this near-death spiral of hyper-individualism, where the prevailing atmosphere is one in which we're all out for ourselves, and those who can't keep up get left behind. Nowhere is this more obvious than in the ever-increasing isolation of the poor and the sick in this country and throughout the world. The isolation of people who typically can't escape their immediate environs. And so one of the most powerful witnesses that we as the church can offer today, I think, is to simply show up. To show up and then to stay put. To say, we as the church are not leaving. We are not abandoning you, no matter how hard things get. We're still here. As the old saying goes, don't just do something, stand there. I think there's a lot we can learn from that as a church in the mission field today, as a church seeking to reach out to our neighbors in need. Don't just do something, stand there. It is no small thing, after all, to stand there these days in our war-torn and weary world. It is no small thing to go and sit, for example, on the same pew as someone who is someone from whom others typically flee, someone who, for example, may be mothering to herself or whose body reeks of alcohol. It is no small thing to share a pew, to stay there with an individual whom others usually shun. It's no small thing, likewise, to call up a friend who is depressed and ask, could I just come over to your house and be with you for a while? Could I come be quiet with you? We don't have to say a thing. I'm not going to try to cheer you up, and I'm not going to start tidying your kitchen. I'm not going to sort through your mail or tell you that this too shall pass. I simply want to be present with you, to sit beside you, and to share in your pain. Okay, as usual, I've said a lot, and I've said it pretty quickly. I'm aware. We have, I think, about 5 minutes, maybe a little more than that. I do want to mention a couple of examples that we have coming up, opportunities to try out this mission paradigm of loving beyond our capabilities. In other words, of not doing quite so much, but focusing on being what we can for others in love and service. I've got a couple of examples of outreach opportunities and mission opportunities coming up that I want to just point out before we go. But before we get to that, any questions or feedback or response, or gosh, this didn't make sense, you were all over the place, tell me. Okay.
So I'd just like for you to kind of summarize based upon this statement that I'm going to make. So is the takeaway that doing good is bad?
No, but I'm glad you asked that question, John. The takeaway is not meant to be that doing good, insofar as doing good is construed along the lines of living out, how shall I put it, our baptismal covenant, okay? Doing things like living out our covenant, the covenant we make in baptism, or every time there's a baptism here at the cathedral, we commit ourselves to doing what? This is a test. What are some of the parts of our baptismal covenant? Seeking and serving Christ in every individual, respecting the dignity of every human being. Things like this, doing good as an expression, as a deep expression of our most basic faith that we are called to in baptism, I think is great. The sort of doing good that I am suggesting that the church and society at large has moved beyond of necessity, and that I see as a positive thing that we're moving beyond, is this sort of old school notion of, I've got to go out and do good works because I have so much, and if I don't go out and do good works, I'll feel guilty or ashamed, or my grandmother did this and this and that, and so I must do that too. My heart's not really in it. I don't want to do it. I dread going out and doing these various acts of volunteerism, but I'm going to do it because that's what's expected. So that's what I'm talking about when I made the rather provocative statement, yes, that... Uh-huh.
I could also argue that good is good regardless of your motivation for doing it. Although, I mean, I certainly do it for the reasons that you're expressing, and I get the point of wanting everybody to kind of focus on that as the reason for the outcome. But,
Absolutely, John. Fair enough, and I love that. I love this back and forth. In fact, I think that the author of the letter to the Hebrews would probably agree to you. Let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers. What one of us really likes to open the door to a stranger? I mean, it could be a Jehovah's Witness who's going to stay there with us for 30 minutes, trying to convert us with a pamphlet. But do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. So absolutely, I don't think that our motivations have to be pure at all. In fact, if you believe, there's been that recent study, did you hear about this, that shows that people who were depressed, who were, took part in a study and they forced themselves to smile for a certain amount of time every day, over time, their depression gradually lifted. It's sort of the fake it till you make it. I don't like that. It sounds too trite and trivializing. But absolutely, doing good is doing good. I guess what I hope to extend today is an invitation to all of us to let ourselves off the hook from doing things we don't really feel called to do. And doing things like, the wonderful Presbyterian minister and author Frederick Buechner recently passed away. And does anybody know, he has a rather well-known, Diane, would you tell us Frederick Buechner's description of a person's true vocation? Mm-hmm. Yep. Absolutely, where your deep calling, and I think he actually uses the word joy, maybe in his description, where your great joy and delight, that feeds you and gives you a sense of purpose and allows you to express your deepest self and your love, your true self, that where you are able to do that in the place where it meets a great need that the world has, that is your true vocation. And I think part of what Buechner was getting at by saying that is that, and he may have said something this direct, in fact, is that God typically doesn't call us to do things that are going to cause us great distress and anger and discomfort. God delights in us, and God wants us to delight in God and in this world. And so when we find our true vocation, which doesn't necessarily mean your job or anything like that, but when you find how it is that you are best able to live out your faith, when you find your true calling, it will be a place where you not only encounter the world's need, but where your joy encounters the world's need. So, kind of an invitation to reimagine outreach and mission as an opportunity to experience and to spread joy, and not just to do something because it seems like it's the right thing to do. Okay, makes sense? Oh, we're just about.